A week passed. Then another talk shows aired nervously. Politicians quoted sound bites out of context. Analysts dissected the hearings like sports commentators. But underneath all the noise, something real had shifted. Ratings didn't rebound. What? Replace them wasn't just silence, it was a change in attention. Viewers were no longer passive. They asked questions. They noticed patterns. People started sharing full interviews instead of cherry-picked clips. They demanded full transcripts. They watched entire segments, not just viral outbursts. They remembered the walkouts, not as meltdowns, but as refusals. Mark Wahlberg turned to Los Angeles, quietly, without press. But what waited for him wasn't Pesset, was a proposal. 2 major streaming platforms approached him with offers. Unscripted series, redemption-themed documentaries, even a dramatic retelling of his The View exit. One pitch called it Walking Away, the redemption hour. Another wanted him to narrate a limited series on celebrity scandal culture. Mark rejected everyone. His response to each was identical. I don't walk off stages just to climb back onto another one. Instead, he focused on something that didn't make headlines. He met weekly with students from his foundation, held small private meetings with former offenders and recovering addicts, and funded a scholarship initiative quietly renamed the Second Step Project. When asked by a local radio host why he was avoiding the spotlight, Mark replied simply, "Because this isn't about being seen, it's about seeing others." Meanwhile, the consequences spread. Crosspoint Strategies officially collapsed under federal investigation. Internal files leaked. One memo outlined a planned celebrity pressure index, ranking public figures based on how easily their reputations could be destabilized during interviews. Another file was more disturbing. It showed how political lobbying groups used talk show viral moments to sway public opinion on criminal justice reform, social aid programs, and election narratives. It was strategic outrage engineered in real time for maximum social division. This time, the public didn't scroll past. They read every word. On Capitol Hill, Senator Ayala drafted legislation known as the Cultural Integrity in Broadcasting Act, calling for transparency requirements in infotainment segments. The bill proposed disclaimers on scripted moments, conflict of interest disclosures. In a public archive for unaired footage, what producers called the cutting room floor. News outlets attacked the bill. Executives lobbied against it. But activists rallied hard. And for the first time in decades, talk show segments were officially classified as high-influence content, triggering regulatory debate on truth in presentation standards. It wasn't censorship, it was accountability. Then something unexpected happened. Whoopi Goldberg requested a private meeting with Mark Wahlberg. He agreed. No cameras, no scripts. Just a coffee shop in Manhattan. Witnesses say they sat in silence at first. Then Whoopi spoke, quietly, honestly. She admitted she had been pressured. She regretted how it unfolded, that she didn't like what she had become on that stage. Mark listened. Then he said, "I know how systems bend people. I don't blame you. I just can't be part of the show anymore." She nodded. He shook hands. And both walked away. The final ripple came during an international media summit held in Geneva. Journalists, producers, and digital creators gathered to discuss the future of responsible storytelling. One keynote speaker was Lena Navarro. In her address, she said, "A walkout is not a collapse. It's a refusal to be misused. The moment we stop turning people's pain into currency, we reclaim what journalism is supposed to be: truth, not theater." Then she surprised the room. She announced a new global nonprofit, Civica, co-funded by a mix of private donors, artists, and media reformers. Its mission: train the next generation of storytellers in ethical narrative creation. Mark Wahlberg was listed as its first board member. Back in the U.S., a student named Jordan, the teenager who once spoke at the Senate hearing, published a short essay that went viral. He wrote, "We don't need louder shows. We need braver silence." What Mark did wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined. And that discipline gave the rest of us permission to stop smiling through setups. No final headlines. No dramatic slow motion, just one quiet scene. Mark Wahlberg at a youth center, sitting cross-legged on a basketball court, a boy beside him reading a book aloud, no cameras, no microphones, just a man once dragged by his past, now helping someone else imagine a future. Not because it trends, but because it matters. The world moved on, as it always does. But something in the rhythm had changed. Newsrooms that once scrambled to create viral outrage segments now cautiously reviewed their editorial strategies. Talk shows quietly adjusted formats, more long-form interviews, fewer forced confrontations. Producers who once celebrated clippable moments now whispered about the Wahlberg effect. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. You could only burn trust so many times before the audience stopped coming back. Meanwhile, Civica, the media integrity nonprofit co-founded by Lena Navarro and supported by Mark Wahlberg, officially opened its first training campus in Boston. Dozens of young students from underrepresented communities enrolled, eager to learn journalism with purpose. Their first lesson wasn't about cameras or scripts. It was a quote, written on the wall in large black letters: "Truth doesn't trend, but it echoes." Mark Wahlberg didn't attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He was 2,000 miles away, helping his team build out a shelter expansion in South Los Angeles. No reporters were invited, no press release was issued, but someone took a photo, a candid image of him handing out water bottles to volunteers, wearing a faded hoodie and dust-covered jeans. That image, quietly posted by a volunteer, reached over 10 million shares in 2 days. The caption was just 3 words: "No mic needed." A year after the infamous View walk-off, ABC aired a special retrospective episode titled "Moments That Changed Us." The Mark Whoopi segment was listed among the 10 unscripted events that shaped TV culture. But the framing had changed. No longer painted as a celebrity meltdown, it was discussed as a turning point in the ethics of public storytelling. One media critic summed it up best. It was the first time in modern talk show history that silence carried more weight than the question. And that silence didn't just end a segment. It started a conversation we're still having. In Washington, Senator Ayala's media transparency bill passed narrowly but symbolically. It required major networks to disclose audience manipulation strategies, including planted questions and emotional trigger tactics. Reality TV wasn't banned, but it could no longer pretend to be journalism. More importantly, the bill unlocked a new form of legal accountability for media influence on public perception, especially during election cycles. Politicians could no longer fund subtle narratives through consultant-backed opinion panels. Every conversation that touched on civic life had to meet minimum integrity standards. The law was nicknamed the Redemption Act. Quietly, it was also known as Wahlberg's Law. Sunny Hostin returned to television, but her tone was different. In her first segment back, she addressed a classroom of journalism students in Brooklyn. Her voice didn't waver. "We all get shaped by systems. Some of us bend, some of us break. But when you look in the mirror at night, you better know if it's your reflection or just a role you played too long." The students clapped. Not because of her past, but because of her honesty. Then came the documentary. Not by a studio, by Jordan the now 18-year-old former youth speaker who had once stood beside Mark in Congress, funded by a grant from Civica. His debut project was titled Unclipped: The Story Behind the Mic. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet, intimate, investigative, and it began not with Mark, but with a series of clips. Ordinary people who had walked off camera, quit toxic jobs, or shut down personal accounts not in rage, but in resistance. Jordan's narration said, "Walking away isn't giving up. It's knowing when your silence is more honest than the platform ever was." The film won Best Debut at 3 independent festivals, 1 year, 1 walkout, and it changed everything. Not because it shattered television, but because it reminded the world authenticity isn't viral, it's earned day by day, choice by choice. Not in studios, but in silence. In the final scene of the story, Mark Wahlberg stands before a group of young men at a re-entry program for formerly incarcerated youth. The building is simple, no banners, just folding chairs and cold coffee. He doesn't speak like a celebrity, speaks like someone who's still learning. He tells them, there'll come a moment when someone tries to turn your story into a segment. When they poke your past like it's entertainment, when they twist your truth for their headline, and when that happens, walk. It's not because you're weak, but because you don't owe anyone your pain on demand. He steps back. The room stays quiet. Then one kid raises his hand and asks, "What do I do after I walk off?" Mark smiles for the first time. You build your own stage, and this time you decide the script, and that was how it ended. Not with a shout, but with freedom. The studio lights were bright, almost blinding. The sound of clapping filled the room as Mark Wahlberg walked onto the set of The View. He smiled, waved, shook hands with the hosts, and settled into the seat with practiced ease. He'd done this hundreds of times. This interview was supposed to be simple talk about his new film, share updates about his education charity for inner-city kids, remind America he was still that tough, reformed guy from Boston who turned his life around. Backstage, everything had seemed normal. His publicist had spoken with producers. They had promised a warm, respectful segment. No surprises, they had said, just uplifting conversation. But somewhere in the production booth, different messages were being passed. In a dark room, full of screens and coffee cups, one producer glanced at an email flagged urgent. The subject read, Engagement Strategy Segment 3. The message was short. Push redemption angle. Challenge narrative. Extract viral moment. Attached was a PDF from Crosspoint Strategies, a powerful media consultancy firm. It outlined what they called performance friction, the method of creating conflict with high-profile guests to drive trending content. A note at the bottom said, use Whoopi, keep tone serious. Focus on contradiction between past violence and public redemption. The countdown began. Cameras rolled. Mark smiled again. He started as expected, talking about the film, the cast, the message. He spoke about young people, second chances, and how his foundation was helping high school dropouts find new paths. The audience nodded, smiled. Some even clapped. The hosts looked interested, except for one. Whoopi Goldberg watched him with still eyes, fingers interlocked on the table. Her voice came in soft but pointed. You've talked a lot about redemption, she began, and that's admirable. But how do you reconcile preaching forgiveness when your early life was so full of violence? The air changed. Mark blinked once. Slowly. The question had been rehearsed before in other interviews, but not like this. Not this early. Not this. Sharp. He leaned forward slightly, the smile still present, but thinner now. I've never hidden from my past, he said. I own it. Every mistake. I've spent years trying to make it right. The audience was quiet. Then Whoopi leaned in closer. A lot of people never get first chances, she said, her voice colder now. Why should Hollywood give you another? One. Mark's face shifted just slightly, sat back, took a breath, then answered, carefully. Because I've earned it, he said. Not with fame. With work, I show up every day. I fund programs. I mentor kids. I don't just talk about change, I live it. Backstage, a red light flashed in the control room. Segment producer whispered, this is it. Don't cut. Sonny. Hostin tried to speak, to pivot back to the charity, but Whoopi pressed on. Some say redemption is a privilege, she said. One offered mostly to men with money and connections. You talk about second chances. But what if the system you benefit from doesn't offer them equally? Mark leaned forward. His voice dropped a little. I didn't buy my way out of anything, he said. I faced it all. My records, my mistakes. I didn't get a free pass. I worked to become better, and I keep working. The tension in the studio was thick now. The audience had gone still. One woman in the front row clutched her purse tighter, and then came the real blow. Do you think Hollywood gave you redemption? Whoopi asked, Because you're a rich white man who plays tough but safe for the cameras. Silence. Even the cameras stopped panning. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Mark's eyes locked onto hers. He didn't yell, he didn't shake, but something in him changed. The warmth drained from his face. His hands tightened slightly. On the table, he looked around the studio, then back at Whoopi. "Is this what we're doing today?" he asked quietly. "Because I came here to talk about hope, about real work. But if this is a performance, I should have brought a script." He didn't wait for a reply. He reached under the collar of his shirt, unclipped his microphone, and placed it gently on the table. "I came here thinking we were talking about moving forward," he said, standing slowly, not being dragged backward for clicks. And without another word, Mark Wahlberg turned and walked off the set. Whoopi didn't move. Sonny looked stunned. Joy Behar tried to smile, but it came out crooked. The camera stayed on for 2 more seconds. Long enough for the world to see the moment everything cracked. Then the screen cut to commercial, and outside that studio, the internet began to burn. Clip hit the internet before the next commercial break even ended. Within minutes, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube were flooded with uploads of Mark Wahlberg's exit. Hashtags lit up like wildfire. Hashtag Wahlberg walks. Hashtag Whoopi vs Mark. Hashtag RedemptionGate. Some called it a walkout for dignity. Others labeled it another celebrity meltdown. But most people weren't sure what to believe. ABC tried to control the narrative first. Their official X account posted a vague message. "Today's episode of The View featured a moment of honest dialogue. We support our guests and our hosts equally in these critical conversations." But it was too late for spin. Clips had already been rewatched 1,000,000 times. Frame by frame. Body language experts were dissecting every twitch of Mark's eyebrow. Commentators began debating whether he was baited on purpose. Behind the scenes, producers at The View were scrambling. "I thought it was supposed to be a soft segment," said one junior assistant to a technician. The technician didn't answer. He just stared at a monitor showing the YouTube homepage where the walkout clip was already trending #1 worldwide. Meanwhile, Mark Wahlberg was silent. No tweets, no statements, no press release. But someone else wasn't. Lena Navarro, a Pulitzer-nominated investigative journalist with a reputation for sniffing out media corruption, posted a cryptic line on her feed. "When public ambush becomes private strategy, the line between journalism and performance disappears." Within hours, her followers exploded with speculation. Navarro had previously written about Crosspoint Strategies, a secretive media consultancy firm known for shaping public perception through curated outrage. She'd exposed how they crafted aggressive talking points and scripted confrontations disguised as off-the-cuff moments. Now, Navarro hinted they were involved again. She posted a screenshot of a leaked internal memo. The subject line read, "Guest strategy, Mark Wahlberg. Redemption versus privilege angle. Approval." Needed before segment, the email showed a producer at ABC communicating directly with a Crosspoint Strategies consultant. One line stood out in bold. "Push Whoopi to confront. Engagement forecast spikes if Wahlberg is cornered early." Ow. The implications were explosive. This wasn't journalism. This was manufacturing tension for views. At a small community gym in South Boston, Mark Wahlberg stood in front of a dozen teens. He was calm, focused, dressed in sweats, no cameras, no crew. Just him and the kids he was helping train. One of them, a tall boy named Uriel. "Yo, Mr. Wahlberg, why'd you walk out like that?" Mark looked at the boy, handed him a towel, and said quietly, "Because sometimes, when they only want your scars, you don't give them your soul." Uriel didn't understand at first. But something about the way Mark said it hit him later that day. A photo surfaced of Wahlberg at that gym smiling, helping a girl learn her boxing stance. The picture wasn't from a paparazzi. It was taken by one of the students. The caption read, "He didn't leave the stage, he just chose a better one." It went viral again. Back at ABC, tension was high. Sunny Hostin had quietly told producers she was uncomfortable with the segment's direction. Joy Behar refused to go off script during the next taping. Whispers of internal division were leaking to media outlets. But the biggest crack came when a staffer leaked Kane internal call recording. A senior producer can be heard saying, "Let's be honest. We didn't book Mark Wahlberg for redemption. We booked him to be challenged. We just needed Whoopi to throw the first punch." That line played on every major news channel within the hour. By evening, Lena Navarro launched a live stream titled "The Price of Performance" inside the new media machine. In it, she laid out a case. The View had received direction from Crosspoint Strategies to escalate tension with Wahlberg. This tactic was part of a broader pattern used on multiple shows, including late-night talk and news segments. The firm had connections to political operatives seeking to shape public dialogue through engineered emotional moments. Navarro ended with a warning. This isn't about Mark Wahlberg. This is about every story, every truth, being turned into a weapon for clicks. And the public deserves better. Yeah, that clip alone hit 10 million views overnight. Still, Mark said nothing. Not a single word online. No apology, no denial, just silence. And in that silence, the public began to choose sides. Some accused him of walking away from accountability. Others praised him for refusing to be part of a system that turned pain into programming. But one thing was clear now. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hearings began on a Monday morning, streamed live across major news platforms. The ornate Capitol Hill chamber, normally half-empty during media ethics discussions, was packed. Journalists, academics, media executives, activists, and members of the public sat shoulder to shoulder, bracing for what many were calling the trial of performative journalism. At the center of it all was a long wooden table. Behind it sat a line of witnesses, including 2 former The View producers, an ethics professor from Columbia, a civil rights attorney, and Lena Navarro. But the chair in the far left seat was empty. That seat had been reserved for Mark Wahlberg. He hadn't confirmed if he would appear. His name was on the agenda. His team had made no public statements. Everyone waited. Then a Senator Ayala tapped the gavel and called the hearing to order. The doors opened. Mark walked in, wearing a dark suit, no tie. Calm, steady, focused. The room didn't applaud. It didn't have to. The silence was louder. Senator Ayala began the session with a warning. This is not a trial of individuals. It is an inquiry into systems that weaponize vulnerability for profit. Those that confuse journalism with emotional engineering. She turned to Mark. "Mr. Wahlberg, thank you for being here. You are not required to speak, but the floor is yours if you wish." Mark nodded, cleared his throat, then leaned into the mic. "I'm not here to attack anyone. I've made mistakes in my life, big ones. I've talked about them, owned them, and tried to rebuild something better. What I wasn't prepared for was having that pain repackaged for profit. What happened on The View wasn't journalism, it was strategy. I didn't walk off because I was offended. I walked off because I was told silently, and then explicitly, that my story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to ratings." The senators were still. "No shuffling papers, no coughing," continued. "I've seen a lot of kids who've made bad choices, try to turn their lives around. You know what they fear most? Not jail, not failure. They fear never being seen for who they've become, only for what they once did. If that's how we treat people on national television, what message are we sending them?" He stopped. A short silence followed. Then he added one final line. "Accountability isn't performance. Redemption isn't a segment." Then he sat back. The room exhaled. Over the next 3 hours, testimony from producers confirmed Navarro's investigation. Crosspoint Strategies had coached segments. Talking points were crafted not for truth but for tension. Whistleblowers revealed a system where emotional escalation was immeasurable. KPI, guests were ranked based on how triggerable their narratives were. One document, entered into the record, outlined a 3-stage model used across daytime and late-night shows. Phase 1. Establish comfort. Lull the guest into safety. Begin with softball questions. Phase 2. Reframe narrative. Turn personal story into a challenge. Insert contradiction. Phase 3. Trigger emotional response. Deploy host pressure points. Create viral moment. Red like, A psychological experiment, and it had Mark Wahlberg's name on it. Outside the hearing, protests continued. But they weren't just about ABC anymore. They were about the future of storytelling. One placard read, "We're not sound bites." Another, "Tell stories, don't twist them." Mark left the building without answering questions. But he made a surprise stop, a high school media class across town. A local teacher had invited him weeks earlier, never expecting he'd show. He sat in the back of the classroom for most of the lesson. Then, before leaving, he spoke briefly. "Y'all want to be storytellers, right? Just remember, real stories don't need tricks, just courage." That night, major networks pulled several scheduled segments. Suddenly began airing more balanced interviews, free of confrontation. Executives were reevaluating editorial guidelines. A few programs even issued apologies on air. But the biggest shift came from viewers. Ratings dropped for shows still using the emotional ambush format. Meanwhile, long-form conversations, uncut interviews, and platforms like No Performance Required began climbing in popularity. People weren't rejecting tension. They were rejecting exploitation. Then came the final twist. Crosspoint Strategies was subpoenaed for a separate investigation. Political manipulation. Documents showed that some viral interview moments had been coordinated with political campaigns. The goal: distract, divide, and dominate headlines. Their most effective tool: manufactured moral drama. Mark Wahlberg's walkout had accidentally exposed more than a media trick it had exposed. A machine. As the week ended, a journalist asked Lena Navarro on a live stream, "Do you think this changes anything long-term? Or is it just another media flash?" She replied, "Change doesn't come from viral moments. It comes from the silence that follows when people finally stop consuming pain like entertainment. That's when the real questions begin." Those questions were everywhere now, not just in politics or journalism, but in every living room where the audience had once mistaken performance for truth, asks ChatGPT. The next morning, a new headline broke across national media. Leak confirms media firm engineered Wahlberg walkout. Tay BC faces ethics scandal. Lena Navarro's reporting had opened a floodgate. Whistleblowers began coming forward. 1A. Mid-level producer on The View confirmed to The Atlantic that Crosspoint Strategies had been embedded in multiple talk shows for over a year, crafting viral friction segments to provoke emotional reactions from high-profile guests. Their method was simple: identify a guest's most vulnerable narrative trauma, scandal, political stance, and design the interview to exploit it. The public believed they were watching spontaneous, authentic moments. In reality, they were watching performances. In the clip of Mark Wahlberg's walk-off, the world saw a man snapping under pressure. But now, people were asking, was the pressure manufactured on purpose? ABC issued a generic statement about editorial independence and ongoing internal reviews, but few believed them. The truth had moved faster than their PR machine. Meanwhile, public reaction began to shift. What had started as a debate about Mark's past and Whoopi's questions was evolving into something bigger, a conversation about how media manipulates redemption, particularly when race, class, or celebrity is involved. Social media turned philosophical. One tweet, with over 1 million likes, read, "Maybe the real question isn't whether Mark Wahlberg deserves redemption, but why we think he needs to prove it to us on cue." In South Boston, Mark sat alone on the edge of a boxing ring, his phone buzzing nonstop. Friends texted, agents called, networks made offers. Every news outlet wanted an exclusive, a statement, a response. He ignored them all. His only call that day was to Lena Navarro. He didn't ask for an interview. He just said, "You were right. This whole thing was a setup." She listened, and she asked, "Why did you really walk out, Mark? Was it anger or something deeper?" There was a long pause. "I could have sat there and defended myself. Again, explained it all like I always do," he said. "But if I had, I'd be agreeing that I owe the world a performance. And I don't. Not anymore." Navarro didn't press further. She simply thanked him for speaking and then told him what was coming next. That evening, She went live with part 2 of her investigation, the redemption industry. Why public confession became a show format. Her report uncovered that Crosspoint Strategies wasn't just advising The View, they were behind interview moments on at least 7 other shows, including 2 late-night talk shows and 1 major cable news program. In each, public figures were pushed to emotionally detonate on camera, creating moments that could be packaged, clipped, and sold. The firm's internal motto, found in an email attachment, chilled viewers, real emotions, engineered timing, viral engagement. The report went viral instantly. Thousands began demanding accountability. A protest formed outside ABC headquarters with signs reading, "I'm not your content," and "Stop selling pain." In the White House press room the next day, a journalist asked the press secretary about the scandal. She paused, then said, "This isn't a political issue yet. It's a national conversation worth having." That line became the next firestorm. Senators from both parties announced a joint hearing into media ethics and the commodification of public redemption. It was scheduled for the following month, and The View was officially named in the investigation. Inside ABC, tension was boiling. Several producers resigned quietly. Whoopi Goldberg stopped showing up for rehearsals. Sunny Hostin and Joy Behar allegedly had a private argument over whether to walk out in solidarity or stay and fix the damage. One producer, speaking anonymously to The Guardian, said, "It's not just about Wahlberg. We've done this to dozens of people, but this time, someone finally walked off." That line stuck. Someone finally walked off. It became the slogan of a growing media accountability movement. As for Mark, he remained silent. Still no interviews, no press tour. But his silence wasn't passive. He quietly funded the launch of a new podcast called No Performance Required. Its mission was simple: give space to people, formerly incarcerated individuals, trauma survivors, youth mentors, who weren't asking for redemption or applause, just space to speak, unfiltered. The podcast's first guest? A 16-year-old kid from Mark's charity program. He told a simple story about surviving gang pressure and staying in school. No tears, no dramatic music, just truth. Listeners were moved, not by the drama but by the dignity. Then came the twist. A hacker group called Glaseco released a cache of internal files from Crosspoint Strategies. The documents revealed that the firm had ties to political PACs and media lobbies. Their job wasn't just about shaping interviews. It was about controlling public narratives around race, redemption, masculinity, and influence. And in one of the emails, dated just 2 weeks before the Wahlberg interview, there was a direct mention Wahlberg's segment is high stakes. Pressure hosts to frame redemption as class privilege. Goal: provoke division. Suddenly, the story wasn't just a media scandal, it was political. And Mark Wahlberg, a man who once walked away from a stage, now stood at the center of a national reckoning. Ask ChatGPT. The media storm didn't fade. It evolved. By the end of the week, The View faced its sharpest ratings drop in 3 years. Sponsors quietly pulled advertising. The network scrambled to stabilize its public image. Whoopi Goldberg took a temporary leave. But everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. ABC had become the epicenter of a deeper cultural and political reckoning. Meanwhile, Wahlberg was in Washington, unannounced, unescorted, and still silent. He wasn't there to testify. Not yet, but his presence sent a message. He sat in the back row of a closed-door ethics roundtable, watching, listening, taking notes. With him were educators from his charity, several community leaders, and one teenage speaker from South Boston. That young man, Jordan, stood at the microphone during the public comment session. "My name's Jordan. I'm 17. I didn't come here to defend Mark Wahlberg. He doesn't need that. I came here to say that people like me, we see what this is. We watch how media works now, and we're not dumb. We know when someone's being used for a moment instead of being heard." Silence followed. Not even the senators interrupted. Outside the chamber, reporters tried to corner Mark as he left. "Mr. Wahlberg, any comment on Whoopi's suspension? On the Crosspoint leak? On ABC's future?" He paused briefly. Then, without a smile or soundbite, said, This isn't just about me. It's about a system that confuses exploitation with journalism, and that system just got exposed. Then he walked away, back in New York. The View's producers were unraveling. Emails leaked by whistleblowers showed a deliberate strategy. Phase 2, scheduled for after Mark's appearance. It involves similarly aggressive setups for other celebrities with complicated pasts. It's an athlete with a domestic abuse accusation, a singer who had battled addiction, and a female politician trying to return after a corruption scandal. Each segment was labeled Narrative Trigger Asset. Each had a pre-approved conflict point to stir controversy. The strategy wasn't new, but now the public had proof. Navarro's investigation widened. She appeared on 60 Minutes, PBS, and even testified before a subcommittee. In every interview, she said the same thing. We must ask, when we consume pain as content, whose stories are we actually serving? Crosspoint Strategies was now under formal federal investigation. Their CEO, Marcus Rell, a former political strategist with deep ties to both media and lobbying firms, went underground. His name trended online alongside words like manipulation, fraud, and culture war engineer. Documents revealed that Crosspoint's media campaigns often aligned with political goals, smear opponents, distract public attention, divide audiences along emotional lines. One email simply read, "If we can keep them angry, they won't have time to look behind the curtain." Now the curtain was falling. Mark's podcast, No Performance Required, climbed to the top of Spotify and Apple's charts within days. Unlike typical celebrity media, the podcast was bare, raw, never sensationalized. One episode featured a formerly incarcerated mother talking about shame. Another, a teacher who refused to let budget cuts silence her classroom. Each story was quiet, thoughtful, and personal. Critics praised the show for being the most radical thing in media. Honest. Mark didn't speak much on the podcast. He let others talk, and people listened. Then, video surfaced that changed everything again. It was unreleased studio footage from The View never meant to air. In it, you could hear producers instructing hosts through earpieces. A voice told, "Whoopi, stay on the redemption angle. Push him again. You need him rattled." Another voice replied, "He looks too calm. Nudge him about privilege next." The footage confirmed everything Navarro had published, and more. Because in the final 5 seconds of the clip, another voice could be heard whispering, "We're not journalists today. We're engineers." This is what viral looks like. The internet exploded. ABC called an emergency press conference. The president of ABC News resigned, live on camera. An internal memo described the scandal as a systemic failure of ethics and integrity. For the first time, Mark Wahlberg issued a short statement. "This isn't justice. It's exposure. But now that we know the game, maybe we stop playing." He didn't say more, but Lena Navarro did. She announced a new global media transparency project, funded in part by Wahlberg's foundation. The mission: audit talk shows, streaming platforms, and political media for deliberate manipulation tactics. It was called Project Stagelight, and its slogan read, "Truth doesn't trend, but it matters." By the end of the month, 2 things were clear. First, The View had lost more than a guest, they had lost the public's trust. Second, Mark Wahlberg had become more than an actor. He'd become a symbol, not of perfection, but of pushback. A reminder that walking away from a stage can sometimes change the whole theater.